Hey, what's going on, Bop Squad? And today's epic video will be... I can't really do this. Someone told me it's good for the algorithm if you scream and yell and have a kitsch name for your audience and don't sound like you're high on Ambien, but no, I can't do this silly stuff. I gotta go with the more chill tone. Somebody turn that wacky music off? Let's get some smooth jazz in there. Maybe some Kamasi Washington harmony of difference. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff. You know, sometimes people ask me why I put jazz in the background, and believe me, it's a lot of people. I like it because I'm a sucker for that local coffee shop that I go to even though I can't afford any of their products' aesthetic. Let's hit it. Recently, I did a video looking at the first level of Demon's Souls and why I think it's the best opening level in video game history. That's a tall order, but I like to think I made my case. After it came out, I started thinking about what is the best first map in Fire Emblem. You know, Fire Emblem. It's basically 90% of the videos on this channel, so I wanted to take that video and tailor it to FE. Looking around online, I found plenty of discourse about what the best level in Fire Emblem is, what the best final bosses are, various different topics like that. I couldn't find anything, though, on what the best first map in the series is, so hey, look at that! We're breaking new ground! At least, I couldn't find any previous discussion on the topic while searching for it. So let's dive deep into the opening levels of the Fire Emblem series and see which ones are the best. And up front, I should say that I almost always get at least one comment, or many more, telling me that my analysis fails to account for different people's definitions of fun, and yes, that's true. Opinions on artistic matters, such as game design, are fungible, and are based on what each person values, enjoys, or dislikes, so consider this the IMO of this video. The first step we have to do is define what the first level in each game is. That sounds weird, and for most games, it's an open and shut case. The first map is the first map you play, but some of the games do have some other issues to consider. For example, do we consider the actual first map of Awakening to be the Premonition or the Prologue? Along those same lines, the first map of Shadow Dragon depends on the difficulty. On normal mode, the first map is Prologue 1, but on all hard mode difficulties, Chapter 1 is the first map. Do we consider the Ties That Bind the first map of Fates, or Chapter 1 Nor? How about the first chapter after the route split for each Fates games? Do we count those as well? Or how about Blazing Sword, where there are different first maps in each of Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector mode? What about Mystery of the Emblem? Do we look at the first map of both Book 1 and Book 2? That, I think, covers all of the games where there is a question about what constitutes the first map. This is what I ultimately decided on as the first map in each game. The criteria I used is that we're assuming starting a completely new game on each game's normal mode. Most Fire Emblem analysis assumes hard mode, but because I'll be looking at how well each level introduces the game's mechanics to new players, I'll be assuming normal mode since some games force you to play on normal mode first, and also most new players are going to opt for normal mode anyway if given the choice. Although we will look at different difficulty levels when relevant. Also, I decided the map must have an obtainable game over condition because that means the player is being put into situations that have consequences. Although this would result in a weird selection for Blazing Sword, so we'll get to that one when the time comes. Overall, my main concern is going to be about how well each chapter introduces basic game mechanics to the player, but story integration will come up a couple of times as well. First maps offer an interesting opportunity for map designers because it's generally the only time in a Fire Emblem game that the designer knows for sure what characters, stats, and equipment that the player will have, which allows the designer to build the challenges specifically around that. This can be a great benefit to the tutorial aspect of first levels. 17 levels is a lot to cover, so I won't be looking closely at all of them. To make our job easier, I'll group the levels into two large categories: large, complicated first levels, and simple, quick first levels. I want to look at the quick levels first, which contains the opening maps of Blazing Sword, Path of Radiance, Shadow Dragon, New Mystery of the Emblem, and Fates. Most of these games each follow a mindset of dividing up early chapters into smaller, increasingly difficult challenges. The benefit of that is that the tutorials get spaced out across multiple chapters, and there are plenty of save points to make sure that players get the satisfaction of making constant progress early on. It's a good motivator, especially for a new player who may not be familiar with Fire Emblem or SRPGs. Since each of these games spreads its tutorials over multiple stages, what we'll be looking for is getting a good bang for our buck. The most lessons that can be jammed into each of these bite-sized maps, the better, and if the level can teach these lessons naturalistically without tutorials, the better. All of these small first maps are based around one controllable character killing the boss of the chapter. Sometimes there is a random dude in the middle, sometimes two, and sometimes it's just the boss. Typically, the goal of these first chapters is to teach players how to move and attack, and sometimes how to use items and seize thrones. These chapters all accomplish that goal, and they're good, they're fine. If you compare these first chapters to the first chapters earlier in the series, like Birth of a Crusader or The Warrior of Fianna, they are significantly simpler. Partly because overt tutorial mechanics like pop-ups and guided movements are more common in modern gaming, and they lend themselves better to these small, bite-sized maps to prevent cognitive overload. The ideal setup, I find, for these maps is to have at least two enemies, one boss and one generic on the map, and allowing the generic to move and attack because the lessons that these maps can teach are more varied. The maps that have at least that minimum setup can teach the player how to move, attack, and chug vulneraries, while also having many other lessons subtly stuffed inside. Players can begin to learn when they should and shouldn't attack on player phase, they can learn how regular enemies move but bosses don't, and they can begin to learn how to use enemy phase to their advantage. Based on this framework, the map that works best is Prologue 1 from Shadow Dragon. Marth has to move through the castle halls, kill a couple dudes, and seize a throne. Even with tutorial prompts, the game leaves everything open enough for the player to make their own choices. They can go hard on player phase or use enemy phase to take on multiple dudes at once. They can go after the enemies or drag them towards Marth. With multiple different ways to approach the level, no action being forced, and the ability to toggle tutorial prompts on and off, Prologue 1 allows for a lot of experiential learning in a low-risk environment. Let's take a look at some of the possible scenarios and see what we can learn from them. Turn 1 is pretty simple. The player can move into any space that they want and there's no danger. Before turn 2 starts, enemies start rolling out, immediately teaching players that generic enemies move. Once the player starts turn 2, there are a handful of options available, and each option results in the player learning key parts of the game. You have these two axe bros here, and you can choose to attack the bottom axe bro, the top axe bro, or choose to attack neither. Technically, there are as many possibilities as there are spaces for Marth to move. 49 if you count every blue space once and count the 8 spaces that Marth can attack from twice. Once for attacking and once for not attacking. That's a lot of options, but with the exception of running backwards out of the enemy ranges, which you certainly can do, let's limit this down to the two most likely options, attacking one of the axe bros or running past both of them. No matter what the player chooses to do, well, except for running backwards, the player will face some enemy phase action. If they attack on player phase, they will see the difference between player phase and enemy phase combat. On player phase, they face retaliation after their first attack, and on enemy phase, they will attack after the enemy's initial attack. This may sound trivial, but it's important in establishing the fundamental difference between player phase and enemy phase and teaching the player the pros and cons of combat in both phases. If the player chooses to run past the enemies, Marth will fight and kill both on enemy phase while being closer to his objective, thus showing that ignoring enemies on player phase can allow you to still wipe them on enemy phase and more quickly accomplish your objective. This is particularly important in Shadow Dragon as there are thieves around stealing treasure and villages, as well as reinforcements that push the player later in the game. Another thing this level teaches, especially for players coming from the GBA and Tellius games, is that dodge tanking is pretty much out of the question. With a nerfed weapon triangle and 1 point of speed only giving 1 point of avoid, these axe bros have 66 hit on Marth or 77.22 true hit. In FE7 or 8, these guys would have had 49 hit on Marth or 48.5 true hit. This is a swing of about 30% in the enemy's favor between the previous games and Shadow Dragon. This lesson is later reinforced by the fact that terrain only gives about half the avoid that it did in the GBA days. Now, this level could be improved. For one, I would move this soldier up 1 space. Since he has 6 move, he would be unable to reach Marth on player 2 enemy phase, but by moving him up, Marth could reach him on turn 3 player phase, which would reinforce the lesson about the benefits of moving quickly. To reinforce the idea that dodge tanking isn't viable and that damage should be assumed, I would rig the attacks from these axe bros so that they always hit. This would also work in tandem with the next change. I would give Marth a vulnerary and jack up the power of the 2 axe bros in the first room. If they had H strength instead of 2, they would put Marth in range of dying to the lance soldier. If the player is then killed, they learn to use their item instead of hoarding and to prepare for each fight ahead of time. If the player rushes into the room and chugs the vulnerary, the benefits of doing actions other than attacking on player phase are reinforced. But, despite these suggestions, Shadow Dragon Prologue 1 is still the most effective of these small first levels. None of the other chapters in this category do as much as Prologue 1 does. Some only have one enemy, such as Fates Chapter 1, or only have the second enemy spawn after you kill the first, like in Prologue 1 of New Mystery of the Emblem or the Prologue in Path of Radiance. These chapters therefore don't really allow for as much learning about enemy movement or enemy phasing early on. Some chapters, like New Mystery Prologue 1 and the Blazing Sword Prologue A Girl from the Plains, force most of the player's moves, which is fine, but learning through doing is much better than learning by following instructions. Generally, I don't like these types of tutorials where you're forced to take certain actions, but New Mystery Prologue 1 really kicks up the nonsense if you're playing with tutorial messages on. Look at these messages! This is the definition of cognitive overload. The biggest mistake you can make when teaching anything is to give too much information at once, and this is a great example of that mistake. Ideally, what should be done in this example is to only talk about one of the battle screen numbers. I'd say HP, but any of these numbers would be fine to focus on outside of crit, since that's less important than HP, attack, and hit rate. A Girl from the Plains at least keeps the explanations simple. But I should also say that these 2 maps, New Mystery Prologue 1 and A Girl from the Plains, are also the tale of 2 difficulties. And even though I'm not really considering hard modes in this video, I would like to mention them here because both of these maps massively improve on higher difficulties. If you play Prologue 1 or A Girl from the Plains on hard mode, then the tutorial messages and forced actions are taken away, making them much better. In fact, on Lunatic, I consider Prologue 1 to be the gold standard for these bite-sized opening maps, since it teaches the player everything mentioned above. Attacking, healing, enemy movement, and it also teaches the all-important lesson of knowing when not to attack. Learning when not to attack is probably the one skill that makes players better at Fire Emblem than anything else. This is what makes the Lunatic version of this chapter even better than Prologue 1 in Shadow Dragon. What I like about these harder versions of both Prologue 1 and A Girl from the Plains is that they give players choice to approach these very rudimentary challenges. Having players make those choices themselves can allow new players to learn from these choices and see how their choices really matter. However, since I'm only considering how well these maps teach new players and thus assuming normal mode, Shadow Dragon Prologue 1 is still the better tutorial level. One final note on New Mystery Prologue 1 is that its story integration is kind of whack. The boss is Jagan, meaning that the game is implying that Jagan can actually be beaten by someone? That can't be right. This must be one of those science fiction games, because I'm not buying it. Speaking of story integration, the map that I didn't include with this group, but should have, is the Fall of Renee, the first map in the Sacred Stones. It has a small handful of enemies like the other maps, but it also has Seth available along with Erica, which adds a nice little wrinkle to this map, making it the only one of these small opening maps with multiple player units. Along with basic lessons like attacking, this map also imparts the classic lesson of Lord Beta, Chad Jagan. The reason I left this map out is because I wanted to talk about it by itself because I don't like it very much at all, and it's probably my least favorite opening map in the series. It's weird to say this because Sacred Stones is my favorite game in the series. It's the definition of video game comfort food for me, but the Fall of Renee is whack, and it's purely for story integration reasons. But let's lead with the cool stuff. Seth begins the chapter with only 13 HP because he got smacked around by Valter in the previous cutscene. This is awesome, and it's one of the only times that I can think of where actions in cutscenes carry over to the character's map status in the series. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any gameplay implications because Seth literally cannot die in this map unless you throw away his weapons and wait for a long time. But that isn't the real problem with this map. The real issue is that Erica and Seth are running away from Renee, which is back here. So why they run back towards Renee and towards the army that's chasing them is beyond me. It's a rare time in this game that the objective of the map is at odds with the story. To fix the story problem with this map, I would put the enemies on the other side of the map at the very top. Have them be some mountain bandits or something, and they're slowing Erica's escape from Renee. Or, if you want to put enemies behind Erica and Seth, you could make the chapter an escape map. As it stands now, though, the story and the objective don't fit. I do wonder if there was supposed to be more to this map at one point, because there is a lot of unused space in this chapter to the north of your starting point. So that's the small opening maps in the series. Most of them are alright, but now it's time to look at the big boys. And these chapters can be a lot more complicated. What separates these maps from the shorter bite-sized maps we looked at before is that these ones typically involve a larger cast of playable units, more enemies and more complex positions, and a lot more space that needs to be traversed. When it comes to playable characters, the classic lineup is Lord, Jagan, Archer, Red Cav, Green Cav, Knight, Pegasus from Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. Most starting classes in the larger opening maps are variations on this type of variety. Some are bigger than others, with my personal favorite breakdown being the Thracia 776 starting cast of Lord, Jagan, Fighter, Archer, Cav. These large starting maps are Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, Gaiden and its remake, Book 1 and 2 of Mystery of the Emblem, Genealogy of the Holy War, Thracia 776, The Binding Blade, Radiant Dawn, Awakening, and Three Houses. Some of these maps are a bit tighter, notably Gaiden, Radiant Dawn, Shadows of Valentia, Awakening, and Three Houses, so we'll look at those a little bit separately. Most of these maps teach the same lessons as the smaller ones by necessity. Most of the smaller maps take around 1 to 3 turns, but these larger maps can reasonably take 10 to 20 turns or even longer in Genealogy's case. Of the subset of smaller large levels, I want to look in depth at Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia. Despite Shadows of Valentia being a remake, these two games each have a different first level. Gaiden has Ram Woods, and Gaiden SOV has Prologue, Alm and Celica. Here's a hot take for you. Gaiden's Ram Woods is kind of boring. Being a Gaiden map is never really a good sign. Enemies here are kinda chunky compared to what most games throw at you in early chapters, so the best way to attack enemies is going to be to gang them with your villagers and to draw them into attacking your units on the forest tiles. This map teaches that one of the best ways to deal with enemies in this game is to take advantage of the insane terrain bonuses. Early on in Gaiden, you have to face a lot of rounds of combat against individual enemies, so terrain is the easiest way and the best way to increase your unit's survivability. Seriously, terrain is absolutely stupid in this game, just as it is in Shadows of Valentia. Shadows of Valentia's Ram Woods works the same way as Gaiden's, but in this game, the first level is a new prologue. The prologue is interesting because it opens a debate as to whether story integration or gameplay lessons should be the focus of early levels. The prologue is an excellent set piece, effectively sets up Mycen as a badass and Slade as both a fun and terrifying cheese villain. However, the gameplay here is a little weird as a tutorial. The gameplay here asks you to do two things: run away with all of your units and kill everyone with Mycen. This is the most bold statement the series has ever made about the fact that Jagans go brrrr. But the thing about Jagans is that there isn't one in Shadows of Valentia. Where's the Jagan? Where the fuck did he go? Is it that guy? Oh, Mycen is a gato that gets to flex in the prologue? Cool. And it is cool. The prologue is cool. Unfortunately, its lessons are to turtle and run away with your weaker units and lean in heavily on your OP units. It's a weird lesson because after Mycen leaves, you don't get a unit that combines high move with OP combat until maybe like Rider's Bane, Clive, and Matilda, but even then that's mostly situational and Shadows of Valentia does a lot to prevent juggernauting. Mycen in the prologue is one of the only times in the game that you can quote-unquote juggernaut a chapter with a single character. And before someone says that you can solo Shadows of Valentia with Cliff or something, you can also solo Pokemon with Goldeen or some shit, or watch a movie on 4 times speed, but that does not mean those are the conditions under which the game was designed and should be analyzed. What I do find funny about this level teaching the player to turtle and hide their weaker characters is that it does get riffed later on in the game. Witches are one of the most unique enemy types in Fire Emblem, able to warp around the map and target your units from behind. If the player is turtling their weaker units behind the rest of their army, witches will punish the player for it, and I think that's pretty funny. and a good way to create unique challenges in a game with otherwise, shall we say, stale map design. Of course, I don't think it's entirely fair to criticize the SOV Prologue for not effectively preparing the player for the upcoming challenges. After all, the characters are all children, and the game does a good job establishing that your units are older and more capable by the time you reach Ram Woods. However, that doesn't mean the Prologue couldn't have done a better job teaching the player how to combine attacks for kills and how to gang up on really strong enemies with weak units. I would have added a Cavalier 8 tiles away from this forest tile with 17 HP, 8 strength, 4 speed, and 0 defense. Faye is the only unit that can reach the forest tile, so placing her there means that she will face the Cavalier on enemy Fays. The Cavalier stats I suggested mean that even if she gets hit twice, she will survive with 2 HP and will have done 4 damage back in return. With 13 HP remaining, attacks from any 3 of the player units on turn 2 will kill the Cavalier. The 4 speed means that no one can double him, and the 8 strength prevents anyone from dying in one round of combat. Not being able to double him means that more units will have to gang up on him to kill, and not being able to die in one round on the first map in the game keeps it from feeling unfair. This lesson wouldn't be at odds with the story. All these kids are carrying around weapons anyway, and it would give the player practice in a skill that SOV tests frequently in its first half, which is having really powerful enemies that need to be comboed to death. Think of the Leather Shield Mercenary, or Desay if you like really chunky boys. Having this new Cavalier would also reinforce the usefulness of terrain, which is something that is pretty common in these large levels. Chapter 1 of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light is built in such a way that Jagan can instantly move to the fort. This is good because it means that the player can instantly learn the benefits of terrain. You get juicy avoid from the fort as well as some nice healing. In Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, there is one enemy whose range can only be reached by Jagan and Sita on turn 1, so no matter what else the player does, Jagan is likely to face at least one enemy if he moves his full range. However, Jagan's range is also not far enough to attack anyone on turn 1 other than the thief, so the most alluring place to dump him is the fort since it sticks out amongst the sea of generic green tiles. Players could also move Sita over the water and forests into range of the first 2 enemies. By arranging the characters in this way, the player has an immediate opportunity to learn about fort healing, terrain, and enemy targeting right off the bat, or they can learn about flying and how it bypasses terrain to reach objectives quicker. This is a subtle detail, but the game defaults the Iron Sword to the top of Jagan's inventory instead of the Silver Lance. This small detail makes it so that Jagan leaves most of the axe bros on this map with 2 HP, making them easy to pick off with whoever the player wants to train, as all of Marth, Sita, Draug, Gordon, Kane, and Abel have enough attack power to finish off any enemy that Jagan smacks around with the Iron Sword. Having Jagan set up these kills is something that Intelligence Systems valued, because in Mystery of the Emblem Book 1, Jagan is auto-equipped to his Silver Lance because he can only use swords while dismounted. The stats were changed so that instead of blowing everyone away with the Silver Lance, he just barely fails to one-shot the enemies, leaving them at about 3 HP. However, Jagan is unable to reach the fort on turn 1, so the Mystery of the Emblem version of this map isn't quite as good. Beyond Jagan's placement, Draug, Kane, Abel, Marth, Gordon, and Sita are placed in such a way to allow them to visit the houses, the shop, attack the thief, or have Marth visit the village. None of these are bad decisions, as the houses provide tutorials, the village provides cash, and the shop provides weapons. By the way, one of the most underappreciated lines in Fire Emblem comes from the right-hand house. Stronger weapons require a higher weapon level. Watch out for arrows! The game even starts you out with $2,000 so that you can buy items from the shop immediately, and you don't have to wait until Marth visits the village to learn how shopping works. The most important part of turn 1, however, is that it's safe. The player can visit villages, houses, forts, the shop, or just move around to random spots, and there is, as far as I'm able to figure, a 0% chance that any player units can die. The thief is also out of range of the village, so the player cannot lose the village on turn 1. As well, the thief won't attack anyone, teaching the player that thieves prioritize running down villages over attacking. Turn 2, however, is a different story. If the player didn't visit the village, opt to deck the first 2 enemies with Jagan's Silverlance, or kill the thief, the pressure is now on to wrap up the enemies, save the village, kill the thief, and prepare for the dirge of enemies that begin moving towards the player on turn 2. This small push that the game gives the player on turn 2 establishes that for the player to retain control of whatever situation they're in, they need to be proactive and they need to get a move on. Now, quickly, I would like to address some pushback that I got on my video, how Fire Emblem balances its hard modes. Some people argued that I was saying that low turn count style playthroughs are the only way to play Fire Emblem, and that playing super fast is the only right or fun way to play. First of all, there is only one right way to play Fire Emblem, and that is to build an army and trust no one. Second, I think I understand why people thought I said playing super fast is the only right way. I squeed when talking about Don 151 and Rangor 1997's 0% growth runs, and I constantly referred to the need to play fast to tackle the challenges that Fire Emblem throws at you. However, what I meant and what I should have been more clear on is that by fast play, I simply mean going faster than turtling. Not blazing fast speed where you're having to play dangerous games with the RNG, but I get where the confusion came from since fast play in the Fire Emblem community is generally used to refer to LTC or LTC adjacent playthroughs. So back to turn 2 of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. At this point, many players are going to have to be proactive to take the emerging pressure off before things get out of control. They'll have to get the village, or gang up on the thief, maybe have Jagan whip out the Silver Lance and hit someone with the big dick. Overall, solving the problems, even the worst ones, that turn 2 can throw at you is pretty easy, but it teaches the player pretty quickly to be prepared to get a move on at a moment's notice to solve problems, such as the constant Cavalier reinforcements in Chapter 7. My favorite part about this chapter is that the lessons taught to the player are based around player choice. Depending on what the player does, they learn different mechanics about the game in a low-risk environment. Another chapter that's pretty good at this is Chapter 1 of Thracia 776. This is a very chill chapter, without there being a whole lot to push the player to move fast, and there is a pretty good reason for that, I think. This chapter contains 2 houses that are character-specific. These houses need to be visited specifically by Orson and Halvin for the player to get the Pooji and the Brave Axe. This is surprisingly important because Thracia likes to make events character-specific, such as returning the children to their houses in Chapter 3, or hide content and characters behind specific actions like capturing Lithis at the end of Chapter 2X. There's another interesting bit of Chapter 1, which is the weapons you start out with. In most Fire Emblem games, you start out with some iron weapons, the Lord's personal weapon, usually a rapier, and a silver lance for the Jagan when you need to hit someone with the big dick. Thracia starts you not only with variations of all of these weapons, with the rapier being the light brand and the silver lance being the flame sword, but also with a brave lance, brave axe, and the Pooji ass. These are 3 incredibly powerful weapons given to the player, which is interesting. In most Fire Emblem games, this would be completely overkill and unnecessary, and it is here too, if you play the chapter like a normal Fire Emblem game. With the exception of the Flame Sword, which you basically need to beat the boss, more on him in a minute, these weapons make mincemeat out of the generic enemies and are completely overkill. Or they would be under normal circumstances, except Thracia 776 has the capturing mechanic. While present in other games like Fates, capturing is at its most robust in Thracia and is a crucial part of the gameplay loop. Capturing allows the player not only to kill an enemy, but to loot their living corpse of all their weapons and items. For the vast majority of the game, it's the main way the player will acquire new weapons and items, as money is a rarity, especially for new players. When capturing, all stats are halved except for luck and HP. To make up for these big hits to strength and speed, powerful weapons need to be used to efficiently capture enemies. Enter in the Brave Lance, Brave Axe, and Pooji Ass, although the Brave Lance does the bulk of the capturing work in Chapter 1. By giving the player such easy methods to capture early on, the first chapter of Thracia teaches the player the ropes to capturing and how to make it as easy as possible. Overall, Chapter 1 of Thracia is fantastic, but it does have one problem, which is that dude right there. See, he's sitting on a gate, and there's one thing that I love about Thracia, and it's thrones and gates. Chapter 1 of Thracia prepares players for capturing and context-specific actions, and also on how to deal with awful bosses with awful terrain bonuses. Thrones and gates in Thracia give a ridiculous plus 30 avoid and plus 10 defense. This is a nightmare. It makes some bosses, especially Gomez in Chapter 8X, miserable slogs. I've been critical in the past of boss design in this series, which has led to some consternation, but here, talking about Thracia's Chapter 1 boss, I'm going to double down on saying that generally, Fire Emblem boss design is boring and bad, specifically with bosses that are stationary and sitting on a throne. Why? It's boring! Bosses on thrones are just random assholes standing there menacingly. The ones with big stats and mega avoid are obnoxious time sinks, usually with only one right answer to deal with them in an effective way, and if you don't have that one way available to you, then I hope you like weaving in and out of their attack range until either the RNG works out in your favor or they break their weapons over your face. You remember Gomer? Remember Hyman? Remember Henning? Remember Gel? Remember Carlisle? But then the stationary bosses that are weak are just there to get bullied relentlessly. You just sick a Jagan on them and watch the boss die a pathetic death. Balker, the boss of Chapter 16 of FE7, isn't a boss. He's fodder for Marcus's axe rank. If you enjoyed fighting Gel, then you have a much higher tolerance for bad game design than me, and if you remember Brigoot, then you should try out for Jeopardy, because what is the most forgettable boss in Fire Emblem? If you want an example of a good boss in Fire Emblem, check out Seelan from Chapter 15 of FE7. That might sound strange, especially because I just criticized most bosses for dying instantly to Jagans, but hear me out. To beat Chapter 15, you don't need to beat Seelan, as it's a defend map, but if you beat him, he drops a very yummy dragon shield, at least on Hector hard mode. As a nomad, he's really easy to whoop if you can get to him, but because of this wall that runs down the right side of the map, Seelan's 7 move, his longbow, the bad dudes he's rolling with, and the turn limit on the map, getting to him is something you need to plan out and think through. In my most recent playthrough, I noticed that Seelan moves first if someone's in his range, so I placed Urk here, the one spot that both keeps Urk safe and out of Seelan's range, and placed Marcus right here in Seelan's range to draw him back down. This got the heat off of Urk, and put Seelan where I could get him, and I'll take that dragon shield, thank you very much. As a boss, Seelan is easier than Weissman, the boss of Thracia Chapter 1, but is significantly more interesting from a tactical perspective. This, of course, brings us back to Thracia, whose first boss is a good lesson on how to approach most of the throned bosses in this game. You shove a Graf Caliber up their ass, or, in the case of Weissman, the Flame Sword. Every other option is just playing games with Fate, but the Flame Sword wipes the floor with him. And while yes, you will always have the Flame Sword for this fight, it does set a bad precedence for Thracia that bosses basically need to be taken out in one way, and then every other way is going to be a nightmare. So if you ask me what big opening map I like the most, I'd probably go with Thracia, followed closely by Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Now, I didn't go into depth with every first map in the series. I'm particularly miffed at the lack of Radiant Dawn and Genealogy talk because I have some things to say about those first maps, but this video is already long enough as it is, and maybe that saves me some material for potential part 2, if the people want one. Otherwise, I think it's about time for me to leave. Tell me what your favorite first level in the series is, or call me a fucking idiot. Anything works. Regardless, I will see you all again soon in the next video.